All right, let's talk about chapter 4, the integumentary system, so the skin. Let me pull up my slideshow. There we go. Okay, welcome back, guys. So this figure I would like you to have nearby as we're talking about the first half of chapter 4, which is the integumentary system. So you should be able to identify the structures that we're going to talk about, and then also discuss the functions of those structures. So you should be able to understand all of that as you go. And having this picture in front of you may be super helpful. So we will go from there. So the integumentary system is composed of two major components: the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin, and then accessory structures like the hair, nails, and exocrine glands. And we'll get into details about each of those. The integumentary system is your body's first line of defense against anything that could cause infection, anything in the external environment, in the room around you or the air. It's kind of a barrier that provides a non-specific defense for your body. The cutaneous membrane is made up of three major layers. The epidermis, if you'll notice here, epi is on top of or on, so epidermis is on top of the dermis. It's a thick layer of epithelium, specifically stratified squamous epithelium. So if you look back at that figure, if you have it nearby, right here is the epidermis. And you can see it looks like it changes as the epidermis, basically as you run from the deeper layer of the epidermis to the more superficial layers. And that's important. We'll come back to why that's the case. The dermis is the middle layer, and it has two sublayers. One, the most superficial layer, is called the papillary layer, and it's created, or it's basically comprised of areolar or loose connective tissue. The deeper layer in the dermis is called the reticular layer, and that's comprised of mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. So some of the connective tissues, or the tissues that we talked about back in the previous chapter, are coming back to haunt us now. So we can actually identify what types of tissues are located in each of these structures that make up an organ system, or each of these organs that make up an organ system. And the skin is an organ. It's created, or it's made, comprised of these three layers. Within those layers, there's connective tissue, there's epithelial tissue. So the four types of tissues: connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous tissue, we have talked about before, make up any organ collectively. And there can be a combination of different tissues that make up one particular organ, and a different combination that makes up a different organ. It depends on the function of that organ. So you can find stratified squamous epithelium in the epidermis. It is what makes up the entire epidermis, along with some accessory cells and structures that we'll talk about. The hypodermis, or the subcutaneous, sub is under, cutaneous is the skin, right? So it's under the skin. It's a layer of connective tissue that's deep to the skin. So it's actually not part of the skin. It's underneath it. Hypo is below or under. These accessory structures are the hair, nail, and exocrine glands. So we'll talk about sweat glands and another type of gland that are accessory structures in the integumentary system. And the cutaneous plexus, which a plexus is a network or a web-like formation. It can be blood vessels or nerves in the body. So this cutaneous plexus happens to be a network of arteries and veins that's associated with tissue in the skin. Just another figure there. So if you looked at it before, kept it near you, you have it again to kind of go back and look. So here's the superficial layer, the papillary layer of the dermis, and then the deep layer. So this papillary layer is comprised of areolar or loose connective tissue. The deeper layer, the reticular layer here, is dense, irregular connective tissue. And you can see all these structures here throughout this layer that are accessory structures. Like here's a sweat gland we'll talk about, with the duct that reaches the surface of the skin. So when you sweat, that's where sweat's coming from. It's pointed out on this side of the figure here. What else do we have here? There's other glands and the hair and hair follicles. So there's an example of structures that are embedded in the dermis. And then where you see adipose tissue or fat tissue, that tissue indicates that you're located in the hypodermis. So one of the major tissues you can find in the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, is fat tissue. If you've ever had a vaccination or an injection from the hospital, they usually inject either intramuscularly, so within the muscle, or subcutaneously under the skin. The integumentary system, it has not just protective functions, but several others, but protection is a major function of the integumentary system, basically by protecting any underlying tissues and organs from either impact or abrasion, fluid loss, chemical attacks. So it's very, very much so just a physical barrier that protects everything that's inside your body. But it also produces melanin, which is a chemical that we'll talk about later involved in skin pigment, but it also protects you from UV radiation, so sun damage. The darker your skin, the more melanin is produced, and typically there's more protection there from the harmful rays of the sun. Another substance produced within cells in the outer layers of the skin, so the epidermis, is called keratin, and that protects against abrasion and repels water. So it actually makes your skin water resistant. So as you drip water onto your hand or onto your arm, it kind of just rolls off. That's because of keratin located inside the cells of the epidermis. And some other functions we'll talk about. There's some cells called dendritic cells that help coordinate the immune response to pathogens or even skin cancer. And then your skin, the accessory structures can be involved in excretion by way of sweat, like salts and water. Those are components of sweat. Body temperature regulation, we'll talk about how the skin is involved in that. Vitamin D synthesis, a really, really, really important vitamin in the body. It's actually a hormone that converts. It basically converted to a molecule called calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D that's super important in calcium absorption in the intestine, from the intestine. Lipid storage, so adipocytes. Adipo is fat and cyte is cell. So adipocytes are located in the dermis and under the skin in the hypodermis. So there's a major storage depot for fat in the skin and under the skin. And then sensory input. There are sensory receptors in the skin that respond to things like touch or pressure, pain, and temperature. So there's really important sensory structures there that we'll talk about. The primary cell type in the epidermis is called a keratinocyte. Remember, cyte is the root word for cell. So these are cells that produce keratin. So these are the major cells the individual cells are called keratinocytes. But the epidermis is this really thick layer of stratified squamous epithelium. And there's actually stem cells. So a unique characteristic of epithelial tissue is that epithelial tissue can renew itself. It can divide and repair and renew itself. So these keratinocytes in the deepest layer of the stratified squamous epithelium, it's not all the same cell throughout this epithelial layer, the epidermis. There's actually 4 to 5 different types of cells located in this thick layer of stratified squamous epithelium. And then as the epidermis at its deepest layer meets the dermis, there are what's called epidermal ridges. So the deepest layer of the epidermis creates these epidermal ridges that are right next to the first layer of the dermis, where you can find a structure called a dermal papillae. And those papillae in the epidermal ridges increase the surface area of the epidermis to help create a firm attachment. So you can see here, right here is this single cell layer thick of dividing stem cells in the epidermis. So this whole layer here is the epidermis. This is all stratified squamous epithelium made from keratinocytes that can produce keratin. At the deepest layer here, this is an epidermal ridge. And that connects directly to the dermis, this layer below, at dermal papillae, these bumps or mountains. That's a dermal papillae. Thin skin covers most of the body. So there's actually 2 types of skin in your body, thin skin and thick skin. Thin skin covers most of the body's surface. So you can find it almost everywhere in the body, other than a few places where you can find thin skin. There are 4 layers that we'll talk about that make up thin skin in the epidermis. and 5 layers in the epidermis of thick skin that's found in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So take a look at the palms of your hands. Think about how tough that layer, that skin is compared to the skin on like your face or your neck. Very different, but just because of one really thin layer. There's 4 layers in thin skin and 5 in thick skin. That extra layer provides more protection and actually increases how waterproof your skin is in those thick areas. Much thicker. So here are these 5 layers. And we're going to talk about these layers. So from the deepest layer here, so this lighter colored kind of spotted layer is the dermis. That's the papillary layer of the dermis, the outermost layer, or more superficial layer. So the epidermis starts here at this dark layer of cells and then continues all the way up to where you see it kind of flaking off out here. And there's potentially five layers of stratified squamous epithelium here that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So keep this figure nearby as you are listening to the next couple of slides. Like the stratum basale, it's the deepest layer of the epidermis. So it's part of the epidermis, part of this stratified squamous epithelial tissue, considered keratinocytes. This deepest layer is a single cell layer thick. So there's only one cell layer thick. So I'm going to flip back and forth between this figure and the coming slides. So to illustrate and kind of point out this stratum basale, see there's only one point here. There's just one cell layer thick along the entire, this is what again creates the epidermal ridge. That entire layer is just one cell layer thick. It's called the stratum basale. Think basal cells or cells that can divide. They attach to also the basement membrane. All epithelial tissue, if you remember, is anchored to the tissue below it. In this instance, the tissue below the epidermis is the dermis by way of a basement membrane. So the basement membrane is what anchors epithelial tissue in place. It keeps it stuck to the tissue underneath it. Most cells here are basal cells, meaning that they're stem cells that can divide, and as they divide, they replace the layers superficial to them. So take a look at this figure again. As the stratum basale, this single cell layer divides, one cell stays, and the one cell that divided from that continues up into the next layer called the stratum spinosum. So just one cell layer thick of stratum basale, those cells are dividing and continuing to move up in the epidermis towards eventually the stratum corneum, this outermost layer of really thick cells. What happened? Okay, we're back on this slide. The stratum spinosum, actually also in the stratum, strewn throughout the stratum basale are what's called Merkel cells. They are a type of sensory receptor that responds to touch. So when you touch your skin and it's very finely touched, so take one of your fingers and just touch somewhere on your skin, you can feel that. That feeling comes from that sensory receptor called a Merkel cell, firing and sending a signal to your brain to say you were just touched on that area of your skin. The stratum spinosum, remember stratum is just layer, and spinosum means spiny, so there's a spiny layer of 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes. They look spiny on a prepared slide. So on the outer, near the cell membrane or at the cell membrane of these cells, the cells look like they have something poking out of them. They start to dehydrate, and the inner components of the cell start to poke through or poke into the membrane and make it look spiny. There's also what's called dendritic cells, and those are the cells that are responsible for the immune response in the epidermis. So if there is an infection or a cell there that shouldn't be there, dendritic cells can help defend against any infection before it gets under the skin. The stratum granulosum. Granulosum is a grainy layer, about 3 to 5 cell layers, 3 layers thick of keratinocytes. The stratum granulosum is where these cells stop dividing. So the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, cells can divide in those layers and continue to move up towards the stratum corneum. Most of the cells here have stopped dividing and they start making keratin. And if a cell is making keratin, it grows thinner and flatter, and the membrane becomes less permeable. So it creates strength and a bigger barrier in the cells to come, in the stratum lucidum or the stratum corneum. So the stratum granulosum, there's a grainy layer, and the granules, these little tiny pockets inside in the cells of the stratum granulosum are what produce keratin. And that keratin makes the cells really tough and thick and resistant to damage and also waterproof. The stratum lucidum is a clear layer. I'm going to flip back to that slide again. The stratum lucidum is really thin. You see this little almost white layer here? That's the stratum lucidum. Like there's a little bit of stratum lucidum. Here's a little bit of stratum lucidum. It's really tough to see this layer on a microscope slide because it's really thin. But it's a clear layer, and it's flattened, densely packed dead cells with keratin. So this just helps further create a bigger barrier, makes the thick skin, remember the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin, right? Makes it, and basically just creates a big, a thicker barrier for the areas of your palm and the bottoms of your feet, soles of your feet. The stratum corneum is the outermost layer, so the most superficial layer. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30 layers of keratinized cells that are stratified squamous epithelium, filled with keratin, and all the cells are dead, but they're really tightly connected by cell adhesion molecules. Remember the connections that we talked about when we talked about tissues and epithelial tissue specifically? Desmosomes are what hold these cells together, and they're really, really tight connections between two cells. More characteristics of the epidermis. Lacks blood vessels. Remember, epithelial tissue is avascular. A is without, vascular is blood vessels. So the epidermis, it lacks blood vessels. It gets oxygen and nutrients from the tissue below it in the dermis. So it diffuses oxygen and nutrients into the epidermis through the cells. And it takes about 7 to 10 days for cells to move from the stratum basale to the stratum corneum. So you can renew your epidermis every 7 to 10 days. Weird, right? Skin color or pigment comes from two molecules or two substances, one called keratin and one called melanin. The degree of dermal circulation also can contribute to skin pigment, but the major pigment in skin comes from those two chemicals. And really skin pigment, so the darkness or the lightness of your skin results from different levels of these two substances being produced. So I mentioned earlier, the more melanin that is produced, the darker your skin. It really doesn't, not truly different than the number of melanocytes. Melanocytes are what produce melanin. It's just how much melanin is produced. Keratin is an orangish yellow pigment, mostly apparent in the stratum corneum, the outermost layer of keratinocytes in the epidermis of lighter skinned individuals. It's also found, this substance is found in orange vegetables. So if you ever see like carrots, somebody who eats a ton of carrots, way too many carrots than a person should actually eat, their skin can actually start to pigment toward a more orangish yellow color. Melanin produces a brown to a yellow brown or even black pigment. It's produced by cells called melanocytes. So cyte is the word for cell, and melano is melanin. So melanocytes produce melanin, and then those are located in the stratum basale. That melanin helps basically protect you from UV radiation. So as the sun, beats down on your skin, the darker your pigment in your skin, the more melanin that's produced, and actually provides protection against UV damage. So here's an example of a melanocyte. So there's little vesicles here that have melanin that gets produced, but a melanocyte is strewn throughout the stratum basale. So this is the deepest layer. Right there would be the basement membrane. So it's tucked just under the basement membrane for the epithelial tissue. And right here would be the stratum basale. So you can see the melanocyte's pretty big and it's kind of branched quite a bit. But that just kind of gives you an idea of where melanin is produced from melanocytes. And keratin is produced from other cells. And these are the cells of the stratum spinosum here. Keratin can be produced here as well. In the dermis, the circulation, the blood flow to the dermis is by way of what's called the papillary plexus. And a plexus is a network or an intertwined, kind of looks like a spider web of blood vessels. lack of blood flow to the skin can result in what's called cyanosis. So if you've ever seen somebody turn blue, cyanosis is basically a lack of blood flow to the skin, where lower oxygen level, oxygen makes it to the skin, whereas otherwise hemoglobin, a molecule that's kind of a darker red pigment, makes the skin look its normal color. But as opposed to oxygen and hemoglobin being readily available by way of blood flow, if blood flow is declined to the skin, you can look like a bluish color, like your lips or underneath your nails. If you get really, really cold in the winter and your fingernails turn blue, that's because blood flow has been inhibited to that area, not cut off completely. So you shouldn't lose your fingers unless it's a really extreme situation, but you can inhibit blood flow to that area, and the nails on your fingers can turn blue. So right here would be blood vessels. There's the cutaneous plexus, arteries and veins. Arteries are always red for the most part. Veins are typically blue. So the plexus is just this network of blood vessels that supply blood to the dermis, the two layers of the dermis, the papillary layer particularly. And then from that blood flow, the epidermis receives oxygen and nutrients. As that blood flow provides oxygen and nutrients to the dermis, those nutrients get diffused into the epidermis, because the epidermis doesn't have blood vessels to provide blood flow. In certain cancers, the most common type of skin cancer is called, one of them is called basal cell carcinoma. It's the most common form. It actually originates in the stratum basale. Remember, the basal cells, or basale, it rarely metastasizes, but it's as a result of mutation that's caused by overexposure to the sun. So basal cell carcinoma isn't incredibly serious. It's pretty treatable, but it's the most common form. It can lead to more severe forms. So you need to take steps to protect yourself from the sun or avoid tanning beds and things like that. So protect yourself, use sunscreen, physical barriers like clothing, or zinc oxide is a physical barrier. There's also chemical barriers like chemical sunscreens, and the UV protection, the higher the better, to protect you from the sun and prevent damage like this. Squamous cell carcinoma is the second most common form of skin cancer, and it's found in areas that are exposed to the skin, that are sun exposed, like your face, your hands, sometimes your feet, the areas that the sun sees every day. And it's more likely to metastasize, meaning it can get worse. Metastasizing cancers are growing cancers. They're basically exponentially growing and getting worse and causing more problems. Treatment for both is usually just removal of the tumor. If it's bad, you can go through chemo and radiation, but these two forms tend to be less severe. Here's an example of a basal cell carcinoma. They tend to be less severe than what's called malignant melanoma. It's the most serious form of cancer, and it is basically cancer of melanocytes, those cells that produce melanin. They grow really rapidly and metastasize into the lymphatic system. And in the lymphatic system, its job is to clear infection, but it sends fluid back into the blood vessels. And once that fluid goes back into the blood vessels, if it's carrying cancerous cells, it can spread. So metastasizing cancer is spreading cancer. And if it makes its way into the lymphatic system, that's when it tends to be really bad. If it's detected early, it can be removed surgically, and the 5-year survival rate is close to 100%. But if it's not detected until after it starts to spread, look at the 5-year survival rate all the way down to 14%. So early detection is absolutely key in this instance. If you notice anything like a change in the size or the shape or the color of a mole, you need to, and moles are just concentrated areas of melanocytes. So where melanocytes cluster together, that's what a mole is. It's the clustering together of melanocytes. And if you see something change in that mole, something's not right. So keep a close eye on the moles on your body and watch so that they don't change. Any change in the shape, size, color, or features like bumpiness, or if it's raised or not raised, if that changes at all, you need to go see a physician and make sure that it's not becoming something like a malignant melanoma. All right, so that's the first half of the lecture. I will see you soon for the second.